by an injection of a fluid. You see an example, a scheme here of a fracture that is injected through the wellbore along the axis V. I use the blue color to show the fluid. The fracture front may or may not coincide with the fluid front. So in this example, you see that the fluid front is not the same as the fracture front. So that's the central part of the fracture is blue, it has fluid inside, and the fluid pressurizes the fracture walls with the fluid pressure PF. And you see that the ends or the fronts of the fracture are white, in the sense that there is no fluid. There are vapors from fluid, but the pressure there is significantly smaller than the fluid pressure. That's why we can assume there is basically no pressure in these white portions of the fracture. The problem unknowns here are: what is the fracture shape? How does it develop with time? Where is the fracture front? Where is the fluid front? And what is the fluid pressure? What is the crack opening? And how do all of this evolve with time? If we look at what processes are going on when the fracture propagates, you see a scheme on the bottom. So it's a 1D representation, but of course the problem could be 2D, 3D. So let's look at this. You inject the fluid with the injection rate Q of T, and the fluid moves within the fracture. The fracture front propagates through the rock material. And here we have a competition between two energy losses. Viscous energy loss, so the energy spent to drive the viscous fluid through the fracture, and the breaking of the rock, so the fracture energy required to propagate the fracture. So I will speak today about two limiting cases of, two limiting illustrations of the fracture propagation. One will be viscosity-dominated, when the fluid is injected at a high rate or viscosity is large, and a toughness-dominated regime where the fluid viscosity is small, like water, for example, and the most energy spent to actually break the fracture, like in a large fracture toughness case. Now, what is XFEM? XFEM is an extended finite element method. You see here two pictures. So on the left, we see a finite element model of a crack. So if you have a standard finite element, then you need to adjust your mesh so that the elements adhere to the crack. When the crack propagates, you need to remesh all this region where the fracture propagates. And also now, to capture the singularity in the elastic fields near the crack tip, you need to have a very fine mesh. So like you see here, the mesh near the crack tip is very fine. At the next time step the fracture will propagate, you need to remesh all of this fine mesh, and so on. So this becomes very time intensive, very computational intensive problem if you want to model fracture propagation. The extended finite element method is a method that is very well suited for this problem. The extension of finite element in this method is introducing in the space of shape functions singular and discontinuous functions. So the first works you can see are referenced in the bottom. Belichko was one of the methods of this in this field. So you can see these papers and a review by Fries and Belichko that gave a lot of reference on what is XFEM. So a small illustration here is, if you have a crack, then you don't need to adhere the mesh to its boundaries. So like you see here, the crack goes through the two-dimensional finite element mesh. And what you need to do is that those nodes, which are illustrated in black circles, have to involve not only polynomial shape functions, but also discontinuous shape functions to represent discontinuous displacement and stress across the crack. And those nodes, which are illustrated with black triangles, in addition to discontinuity, they also have to involve a singularity to represent singular displacement and singular stress. So that's the main idea. And now this is the weak form for the extended finite element method. And for those who is familiar with finite element method, I can say it's very similar to the finite element method. The only thing that changes is your space of the shape functions. So if we look at a body with a fracture and we want to find the displacement u as a function of loads, so there can be body force, there can be tractions, then assuming that the body deforms as a linearly elastic material, we have this weak formulation in the standard finite element, which says that, this is basically a variation of the potential energy principle. So you need to introduce virtual displacement, you need to introduce your representation of actual and virtual displacement through shape functions. Then you substitute this representation into the weak form, you integrate the products of the shape functions, you obtain the stiffness matrix K, and on the right-hand side, you integrate shape functions times the tractions or the body force. So you obtain this linear system, which is shown on the bottom, which is KD equal to F. So here K is the stiffness matrix of the finite element. D is the vector of unknowns displacements, the nodal values of displacements. And then you can solve it, D is equal to K minus 1 times F. In reality, we never compute the inverse matrix K, but this is one way to show that we will solve this linear system. So this is a problem that you will need to solve many, many times when you are coupled and dependent problem, but this is the core of the elastic solver. The enrichment for a crack, a combination of heavy segments which are shown in light gray. Their singularity should have discontinuity. So we show here heavy side in that are affected by the singularity into the elastic fields. So let's see how clear this that. This is a discontinuous function. You can imagine that basically, if you have an element, this is how you introduce a discontinuous enrichment. So you say, you just introduce a Heaviside function or a sine function into the shape function space. Now, when you want to model the crack tip, you introduce shape functions that are proportional to the psi tip functions. So in other words, the square root of r times the trigonometric functions of angle theta in the polar coordinates r and theta related to the crack tip. In particular, this will capture your usual crack width asymptote shown here, W proportional to K prime over E prime times S to the power 1/2. This is a standard linear elastic fracture mechanics tip asymptote. S here is the distance from the crack tip. K prime is the scaled stress intensity factor. So basically, this formula gives us that the crack width will behave as a square root times the stress intensity factor in mode 1. In mode 1 and 2, in mixed mode propagation, you see below how the displacement components will behave as functions of the polar coordinates r and theta. And then the enrichment function psi tip, it represents the 4 functions that are the basis for this U1 and U2 functions. So in other words, when you introduce into your polynomial shape function space a Heaviside enrichment and this singular crack tip enrichment, you are able to represent correctly the displacement and stress around the crack. And it allows for the extended finite element method to obtain the optimal convergence rates if you discretize the problem and solve numerically. This is just a note that often in hydraulic fracture problem we look at viscosity-dominated regime in which the crack width behaves not as the square root but as a different power law. So here's an example, S to power 2/3. And in this case, the crack tip enrichment is similar, but it's proportional to R to power 2/3. Now we go back to modeling the processes in the hydraulic fracture. We find fluid pressure, crack widths, and how to the equations to linear elasticity. On the bottom, you see that W is the crack opening, crack width, is equal to UN plus minus UN minus. So basically, we will use XFEM to obtain W equal to D of PF, which means the crack width is a functional, is a function D of the fluid pressure PF. So once we find fluid pressure from the lubrication equation, we will use it in the XFEM to find the crack width. Now this is the lubrication equation to solve for the fluid pressure. So you have PF is the fluid pressure, crack width is W, and you have this nonlinear equation. Boundary conditions are that the crack width and the fluid flux Q are 0 and the crack tips. This is a nonlinear PDE, so once you discretize it, you can solve it iteratively. We use a Newton's algorithm to solve for it. I must say, so it's okay, you can use Newton's algorithm, but it's not that easy because in a viscosity-dominated regime, the fluid pressure is singular. So it's not easy to solve a coupled problem using Newton's algorithm where you have a singular solution, right? So I will jump over it relatively quickly, but if you have questions, we can discuss it after the talk. Basically, if crack width behaves as power S to 2/3 in the viscosity-dominated regime, then the pressure will behave as S to minus 1/3 within the fracture. This is, of course, a mathematical, it is a mathematical solution to the equations, but when you solve these equations numerically, you need to capture somehow this singular solution, and it's not easy. So for this viscosity-dominated regime, okay, I will not look at this, but we have modified somehow the weak formulation based on Zillen and Free's paper, where you actually can introduce the tip asymptote of the crack width to help you to formulate new boundary conditions. Okay, so another remark about the tip asymptote is that it actually provides us a means to find the fracture front with time. So in this example, in the viscosity-dominated regime, you see that crack widths behave as this expression, something times S to power 2/3. If you look at the second equation, this shows that at a certain discretization point, Wn minus 1 equal to a function of L, where L is the length. So basically, when you solve your coupled, numerically you solve your coupled problem, for each specific time, for each trial fracture front location, you solve for crack width and pressure, and then you can invert this second equation to find that your new guess for the crack front is equal to some expression which depends on your numerical crack width. So basically, it prosets, I think I should have it, okay, here. This shows you a sketch of the discretization and coupling XFEM to the lubrication equation solver. Basically, let's just look at the last two equations. The discretization of fluid flow equations gives you a nonlinear equation, matrix M times the vector of crack width, W, minus the time-dependent nonlinear component, matrix A as a function of crack width, times the pressure equal to B, and B will be some source, like the injection rate, injection rate dependent source. And now from the XFEM, you have the last equation. W is a functional, D times P. P is the vector of the non-fluid pressures. So you couple these two equations, they will be matrix, matrix vector equations, but you couple them and you solve them using Newton's method to find crack width W and the fluid pressure P. So this is how the algorithm steps in time. You have initial solution, you assume a certain time step, you assume a certain trial crack front location, And for this, delta L, trial crack extension, you solve elasticity and lubrication equation, and then you update your crack lengths based on the inversion of the tip asymptote, f-1. This algorithm to find the crack lengths based on the inversion of the crack tip asymptote is called the implicit level set algorithm. It can be found in the papers of Anthony Pierce from the University of British Columbia. And if you're interested, I can give you the references. This is a step that I will not look at it right now, just to tell you, we have studied what are different strategies to make the computations faster. So one way is to remove the crack tip enrichment and use the sign enrichment. There are certain, certain issues how you use it correctly, because you're not representing the singularity correctly, but it can be done. So we call this version of XFEM S, which means that we only use a sign enrichment. Running different tests, checking the accuracy. So you see here a static problem of a crack. This is a static elastic problem, but you will need to solve this problem many, many times when you solve a couple time-dependent fracture propagation problem. We solve two elastic problems. One corresponds to k equal to 3. K is the dimensionless toughness. So k equals to 3 is a toughness-dominated case, and k equal to 0 is the viscosity-dominated case. On the bottom plot, you see the relative error in the solution between the exact solution and the numerical solution with the XFEM. The red error is the tip-enriched solution, and the blue one is where you don't have the tip-enriched XFEM. It's just the sign-enriched. And in both cases, we have a good accuracy. So of course, the crack tip enrichment has a better solution near the crack tips. So you see where zeta is -1 + 1. This is the crack tip locations, and the error in red goes below 10 to -3, while in the sign enriched in the blue it goes to 10 to -1. But in the far from the crack tips, both methods give an okay solution. So this is basically the convergence rates are okay for both of those methods. To show you, to entertain you a little bit, to show you a movie, this is a propagation of the viscosity-dominated fracture. I will try to run it, but I'm not sure it works. No, okay. Okay, unfortunately, I cannot run it right now in the slideshow with Zoom. Okay. So to finish this part of the talk, this was a movie of propagation of the cracks through the finite element mesh. You see on the top left the mesh with the starting location of the crack. Crack is in red, and you see that it's just a structured finite element mesh, so you don't have to adjust, you don't have to remesh the mesh, you don't have to adjust the mesh to the location of the crack. And basically, this video shows that the XFEM solution corresponds to the exact solution very well. Now I'm going to the second part of my talk, which is about the non-planar fracture propagation. So so far we have found how to use XFEM to model a planar fracture, but we have not thought yet about how to model a fracture propagation. So it's one of the problems in the open problems in fracture modeling right now in the HF community is how to model a 3D propagation fracture. And you need to, first of all, it's computationally very intensive because you need to track the front. For each trial location of the front, you need to solve those coupled equations. And then you need to properly verify your simulator. And it's not easy because there is not, how do you verify a new 3-dimensional simulator? So we have a 2-dimensional simulator, but if we change all the equations to radial symmetry, then we can have a 2-dimensional model of a radially symmetric 3-dimensional fracture, and we can use it to test 3-dimensional simulator. So this part will be devoted to developing an axisymmetric modeler based on XFEM that can be used in the future to provide a test for accuracy for the 3-dimensional simulators. And the main motivation for doing this was that there is a paper referenced on the bottom, Gordeliy, where I was involved in a project. We developed a boundary element model to compare it with the results of laboratory experiments performed in Australia in CSIRO back in 2004. So the experiments were on fracture propagation near surface. They were hydraulic fracture propagated near the surface, and because they propagated near a free surface, they would curve towards the free surface. So back in 2013, we used a boundary element model to compare with these experiments, and now we can do the same for the XFEM model. So it provides a very good check of the model and provides a very nice, validation of the equations and of our strategy to propagate the fracture. So on the bottom, you see, on the left, you see a scheme of a fracture that propagates towards the free surface. It curves towards the free surface, and eventually it will break to the free surface. And on the right, you see the picture from the experiments. It's a glass block, and you see a wellbore is a shaft in yellow color in the middle, and then you see a blue fracture, right? That goes a blue color fracture. It's a fluid filled fracture that curves and creates something like a bow, a milk bow. We will model something like this. So what is interesting about this problem is when a fracture propagates near a free surface, it can be not completely fluid filled. It depends on the toughness and viscosity combination. So it turns out that in the viscosity-dominated regime, if the fracture is near surface, you have a fracture tip that is not fluid filled, like the picture on the bottom on the left. Now in the toughness-dominated regime, the fluid and the fracture front will coincide, like in the picture on the bottom in the right. So we'll need to develop a scheme that can handle both of the situations. Interestingly, so actually it's on the one hand easier than the previous implementation, because in this case, you don't have a singularity in the pressure fields in both of these cases. So you don't have to handle singular pressures, and your solution becomes more regular. But on right now, you need to also capture the fracture, non-planar. You need to think, how do you correctly model location of the fracture? So the algorithm is the same, but we introduce one more unknown. It's the location of the fluid front. And you will see right now we have one more loop in this combination of nested loops. So for each time step, a given time step, you assume a trial crack front, you assume a trial fluid front, and then you solve your nonlinear system for opening of pressure. You update trial fluid front, you resolve all of this, and then you update trial crack front, and then you update, once the crack front converges, then you go to the next time step. So there is a system of 3 nested loops, and you can see that it's quite computationally intensive. Okay, what needs to be done for the fracture curving part is we can use the same sort of tip asymptote, but right now it's not mode 1. It's mode 1 and 2, mixed mode propagation. So you can see the first equation gives you the standard mode 1 crack width. The second equation gives you mode 1 and 2 propagation criterion. And it's very similar to the mode 1 in the sense that in the mode 1, it's only crack width is proportional to square root of S times the scaled stress intensity factor. Now in the second equation in modes 1 and 2, you have that the crack width in combination with V, which is a tangential displacement jump. So their combination is now proportional to the stress intensity factor times the square root. And you can use this in your implicit level set algorithm as a tip asymptote. It works very well. To locate the fracture, where does it turn at each time step, we use the third equation. It's from maximum tangential stress criterion by Erdogan and Sich. And basically, once you know K1 and K2, the stress intensity factors, you can find the direction of fracture turning by this formula. Okay, so now let's look actually at the comparison of our of the results with the experiments. Andrei, how much time do I have?
So just keep your time. It's 2:30. So I think you can have another 10 minutes. We'll see if we get a cut or not.
Okay. Okay. So On the, this is a summary of the laboratory experiments from CSIRO from Australia that were run by Andrei. You can find more details in the paper that's referenced on the bottom or in the PhD thesis of Andy Bunger from 2005. You see in this experimental setup, body of a sample which was either made from PMMA or glass. The body of the sample is on the right. In this, there is a block of PMMA plug, but it's not the sample. It's just a plug that's used to secure the specimen inside the Hoek cell. So on the right, you see a specimen. There is a wellbore, and then there is initial flow through which the fluid is injected from the wellbore. And then you see a dashed curve which shows the direction of fracture, fracture trajectory. So in principle, this fracture will be radially symmetric. So you can, in 3 dimensions, you can think about it as a bow, as a bow shaped fracture, but this is just a cross section of it. On the bottom, you see the table. There were a number of experiments in this series done by Andy Bunger, but we just used 5 of them in this work to compare our model to the experiment. So you see there will be 2 experiments done in PMMA in the table and 3 experiments done in glass. The difference between experiments in PMMA and in glass is that experiments in PMMA were rather toughness dominated. So in PMMA, the fluid front was coinciding with the fracture front, while in glass, the toughness was not as large, as you can see from the K1C column of the table. And these glass experiments were more viscosity dominated. So there was a significant fluid lag. And there, the challenge was to actually capture separately fluid front and the fracture front. So let's look at the results of the XFEM model. You see here on the top left, it's the finite element domain. We see the wellbore wall. You see the blue shows you the cross section of the fracture, and then on the right, on the right top, you see this is the finite element mesh, and the crack which goes right through the finite element mesh. Right, it's an example from one of these 5 experiment, 5 tests with the XFEM. So if you look at the bottom, it shows you the cross-section of the fracture trajectories obtained from 3 sources. The blue symbols are the laboratory results of Andrei Bunger. The red curves, they are, the legend says this is ORIBC. So ORIBC was that boundary element method model used initially to compare the results with the lab results. And our XFEM results are in black. We can see here that XFEM captures the fracture trajectories very well. On the one hand, it is in good agreement with the boundary element model. So it provides us a check of the numerical algorithms and everything, that it works fine, it converges, it works good. On the other hand, we have a good comparison with the lab results. Let's look at a time evolution of the quantities. You see here the results for the viscosity-dominated case. So again, this is in glass, and these experiments were characterized by significant fluid lag, in the sense that the fluid front was not the same as the fracture front. In the column on the left, you see for 2 experiments, the difference between them was the applied confining stress. You see that the results from both numerical models, XFEM and boundary element method, are in very good agreement with the laboratory results for the fluid pressure. And on the right, you see this is the results for the maximum crack opening. So crack opening in the center of the crack. And again, we have a very good comparison of the results with the boundary element method and with laboratory results. So what's shown here is how crack opening and how fluid pressure in the wellbore develop with time. Time is in seconds, so from 0 to 7 seconds. And then, so we are very happy to obtain such a good correspondence between the model results and the lab results for such a challenging numerical model, numerical problem, I would say. But not everything is perfect, of course. So this is for the same viscosity-dominated case in glass. Now we look at the location of two fronts, the fluid front and the fracture front, and they are different, right? So if you look on the top plot, the blue symbols are again the lab results. The curve with the circles is the radius of the fracture. The curve with the crosses is the radius of the fluid front. They are different. And now if you look at the red, which is the BEM results, and the black, which is XFEM results, the fluid front is captured very well. So the bottom curves, crosses in blue, red curve, and the black dashed are all, you know, together. So this is great. So we are capturing the fluid front very well. But if you look at the fracture front, the curves above it, you know, the blue with the circles are not the same as all numerical results. So bold red is a boundary element result for the crack front. The bold black and the dash black are the XFEM results for the crack front, and they're not the same. On the bottom picture, you see very similar comparison of the crack front and the fluid front for another test in glass. This, you know, consistently for 2 experiments in glass, we have an overestimation of the crack front. Why? We try to, you know, run, do we represent the boundary conditions correctly? Looks like yes, we represent the boundary conditions correctly, but we could not find any specific explanation for now. What needs to be changed in the model to better predict the fracture radius? So that's an open question yet. And now quickly looking at the toughness-dominated results. In this case, this is a completely fluid field fracture. So the fracture front is the same as the fluid front. Again, the correct trajectories are captured very well for 2 laboratory tests. Here we have the radius on the left column. We have the radius of the fracture in the fluid front. The models, both models capture them very well. And you see that in these cases, the blue circles coincide with the blue crosses, which means that in the lab, the fracture front was the same as the fluid front. And so in both models, the fracture fronts are the same as the fluid fronts. In the right column, you see how the wellbore pressure is modeled. And again, we have a very good comparison of the lab results for the pressure and the model results of the pressure, which is very nice. But again, not everything is perfect. So if we look at the crack opening, we have an overestimation of the crack opening from both models. You see here on the top picture, the blue is the lab results for the maximum opening in the crack, how it evolves with time. And you see that the 2 models, red, the boundary element method, and black, the XFEM, are overestimating the crack opening by about 10–20%, especially towards the end. And you see the same overestimation you can see on the bottom picture, which is for another test. So again, for 2 tests in toughness-dominated regime, we consistently overestimate the central opening. However, in this case, we have an explanation. We look at this picture on the right, which is a picture from the experiment by Andrei from his PhD thesis. This is 2 snapshots, one at point A in the top test, and B is the point B in the top test. So if you look at the top picture, point A corresponds to time equal to about 3.5 seconds, and point B corresponds to time 5.6 seconds. So if you look again on these snapshots from the experiment, you see that at 3.5 seconds, the fracture is relatively readily symmetric. But then it loses its axial symmetry, and at point B at 5.6 seconds, it becomes more like an egg-shaped fracture. And because now it lost its radial symmetry, the point of maximum opening moved. So you see the shades of gray here show the opening, and the largest opening where the shade is the lighter. So you see in this in the bottom plot from the experiment in B, you see that the maximum opening, which is about 0.25, has moved from the center towards left and bottom. And now if we estimate from this picture, what is the opening, what kind of gray shade, what is the opening in the wellbore, near the wellbore, we can put this cross on the top numerical figure at time b. And you see that there is this cross, which is actually very close to the results of both models. So in this case, with the toughness-dominated regime, we think that we actually capture well the opening for a radially symmetric fracture, and this discrepancy is only due to the loss of the radial symmetry in the experiments, which means you actually need not a two-dimensional radial model, but a three-dimensional model to really capture these experiments. So in summary, I have presented to you an XFEM framework, which we developed for simulation of hydraulic fractures. It can handle singular pressure field. It can also handle non-planar fracture propagation in 2D, georadial non-planar fracture propagation, for example. It can capture fluid lag. And we have been very happy to obtain a good comparison of the numerical results with the results of the laboratory experiments. Of course, this comparison opens, many more new questions, but we will be working on in the future. We are hoping to solve some of those questions. I would like to thank you here, and I can answer your questions.
Okay. So thank you very much, Lisa, for this nice presentation, and essentially also for being so courageous to get into this new experiment of talking. So I want a big applause from everybody. If you can, you have a small reaction place in your slide. So let's see what happens. So you should, I don't know how you can see these hands. Bravo.
Thank you.
Everybody. Okay, I think we can now get to some questions. So let's try to function in a pretty organized way. So who wants to give a question? Okay, so I have some questions. So first, the experiments were done on PMMA. And my question was, is PMMA really elastic, or would viscosity play a role in the solid part of the experiments? And it's not clearly a brittle fracture model. So how does this play with the measurements in the experiments?
Okay, so you see, in this sense, we have not discussed changing the model for non-elastic material. I think it will be great to investigate this, but our XFEM and the coupling of the XFEM currently uses the principle of, how do you call it? It is actually based on the assumption of linear elasticity because it decomposes the solution into a number of solutions. So for now, I don't think that it's easy to introduce nonlinear effects in the solid mechanics. Okay. in this model. Regarding the measurements itself, so this question I can ask to Andy Banger because he was running these experiments. Honestly, I don't know much, but their motivation back in 2004 was to develop, it was related to a mining project and to stability of the rock masses in mining. So they were planning to develop the model for practical applications, and test it with the laboratory results. So they were also looking at linearly elastic materials at that time.
Okay. So Patrick now has a question.
If you had a really 3D, let's see, ellipsoid one crack, how will you adapt the XFEM then?
Patrick, I cannot hear you well. Could you please repeat your question?
I mean, now that we have seen that the crack was not radial but more elliptic,
Yes.
do you see a way of extending the approach to such an elliptic geometry?
Okay, so this this fracture is not just elliptic. I mean, it completely lost its symmetry, right?
Okay.
And also in experiments, they actually noticed that there is also mode 3. So it's there was, you know, something not just captured right now in the model. I think for all of this, you would need to develop, or we would need to develop actually a 3-dimensional model. Which means right now the model is essentially 2D and the crack is essentially a line or a curved, you know, a combination of segments of lines. To develop a 3-dimensional model means you need to have a 3-dimensional finite element method, 3-dimensional extended finite element method, and then a 2-dimensional fluid solver, which is possible, but of course it's a much larger work to do, both theoretically and numerically. So it is possible, but this work was exactly to move towards, you know, 3D in a way that was possible using the 2-dimensional model. So it was one step, say, towards the 3 dimensions, and then moving completely to 3-dimensional model. This is a much more challenging, numerically challenging problem.
May I ask a question?
Yes, hello?
Hello. I assume that you, in the computations of the fluid front, you assume that the crack faces are smooth. And I guess that in amorphous materials like glass or PMMA, it must be relatively correct. But for crystalline material, I guess that the roughness, the crack face roughness might become important. Do you think it might have an influence on the accuracy of the computation?
Okay, so let's look at the actually the comparison of the fluid front in this viscosity-dominated case here. In this case, the fluid, you know, regardless of where the fracture is, the fluid front is captured correctly. Now that gives us, you know, some, you know, reassurance in the correct numerical solution of the fluid front equations. Of course, when you have roughness, so there is 2 aspects that you need to introduce into the model. One is roughness. How does it affect the propagation of the fracture if the fracture is completely fluid filled? So if there is fluid in the crack tip, does it change the, you know, does it change the energy balance, the fracture toughness and things? So there is a paper by Dmitry Gargash. I'm not sure it's a paper, but it's a conference abstract where he was presenting the correction to the fracture toughness based on the of the walls of the fracture. You know, so that's one idea how you can adapt your model to introduce some roughness of the fracture walls. The other aspect is the lubrication equation itself, right? So if you have, right now what we assume is that there is no tangential stress applied from the fluid onto the fracture walls. So I assume if you have rough walls, you would need to introduce some tangential stresses that fluid would exert on the fracture walls. So that will change your, you know, that will change your equations.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Veronique, for your question. Stella wanted equally to ask a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, Stella.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the presentation. So I'm always worried about the crack path dependency of these methods. So I was thinking, I mean, because of the method that you're using, there must be some numerical fracture toughness that you have. And I was wondering if you observe some crack path dependency because of the enrichment that you're using at the crack tip. And then the second question was, how do you define the crack tip, meaning the number of elements ahead of the crack where you actually do the enrichment, right? Because in a more perturbated energetic landscape, you don't know how far the crack sees, right? So how do you choose it?
Okay, so in this case, we have the model just assumes a specific location of the crack front, and when you know that, okay, say my crack front is exactly here, you introduce a crack tip enrichment, which depends on this location of the crack front. Once the crack front advances, you move the crack tip enrichment. How large must be the area of the crack tip enrichment? It's we have done some tests. It's not once it's sufficiently large, maybe a radius of 1, 2, 3 element lengths around the crack tip, it doesn't bring any much difference in the numerical solution.
Right, but in a homogeneous energetic landscape, you meaning that the material, besides the crack and the fluid into it, the material is completely homogeneous,
yes,
right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and do you observe any overall effect in terms of crack path dependency, meaning besides the incremental update that you do on the crack front, the overall crack path, does it depend on the enrichment you're doing or not?
Yes, okay, it's actually, thank you for this question. It's very nice because I can go back to some of the slides that I jumped over. I can show you two things that are related to this question. So one, if we go back to the slide with the where, the XFEMS enrichment that I was mentioning, this one, this is a strategy to make computations faster if you have a non-planar crack, where we don't have a crack tip enrichment, so we don't have any suitable singularity in the shape function space, but we only introduce discontinuous enrichment, the sign enrichment. In this sense, your crack location within one element is only weakly, is only prescribed in a weak sense, because you cut the complete element once it's touched by the crack tip. And this, this has shown for a planar crack, the results were good. So as I said here, the results in blue are for this reduced enrichment strategy. And it's sort of okay within the main body of the fracture. It's not as accurate near the crack tip, but the results were still, if we look at these convergence rates, the results were still good for time-dependent problems. For, the error is under control and you can model time-dependent propagation. But this was for a planar fracture. Now, if you use the same sign enrichment for a non-planar fracture, when you start to curve your fracture, because the curvature now in the algorithm is based on the stress intensity factors, and stress intensity factors are linked, of course, to the singularity. Once you dispense your singularity, once you don't have singularity in the crack tip in the crack enrichment, you cannot get this correctly. So what we found is that if you use XFEMS, you need to be very, you need to be cautious when you do non-planar fracture. So for the non-planar fracture in this work, we only use complete crack tip enrichment in order to correctly capture the crack path. So that's, one part answer to your question. Another question, did we observe any crack path dependency? We have done the following test. I will show it to you here. Okay, so after we found that our results for the glass have correct fluid front radius, but don't have correct crack front radius, we were thinking, do we actually model the boundary conditions on the specimen correctly? So we tried to model different boundary conditions, and if I go back to the setup here, so you see the specimen, there is a specimen on the, on the right, and there is a PMMA plaque on the left. PMMA plaque is it was just an auxiliary, block of PMMA that was put into the Hoek cell to secure the specimen there, so that the specimen is not jumping out of the cell. And what is the boundary condition on this interface between the PMMA and the specimen? Is it, is there friction, or is it more like traction-free surface? We were thinking, so maybe this is something that would change the trajectory and help to get the crack front, modeled better. So that's one test that we have done. On the top, you see the results from the experiments in blue crosses, and you see the two black lines. The solid black is from XFEM when we assume traction-free interface, and the dashed black line is from the XFEM if we assume that there is a bond between the plaque and the specimen. So the real boundary conditions could be something in between these two black. But and so this boundary condition actually changes the trajectory, right? You see the trajectory is slightly changed. But now if you look at the bottom, the displacement has a very different nature depending on the boundary condition. So if you look at the displacement evolution in solid black and dashed black, it has a different evolution after time equal to roughly 2.5 seconds. So I would say the crack path, yes, there is certainly dependency of the solution for the crack width and fluid pressure on the crack path. Now here in this test, it's not only the crack path, it's also the different boundary conditions. But if you say use the same boundary conditions and if you have slightly different crack paths, it's still, it will affect the pressure and the crack width, but not that much. We have also tested, if we change, if we change certain parameters in our search for the maximum stress ahead of the crack, do we have a different fracture trajectory? So we have done that, and it's not changing very much the trajectory.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think we can stop with the question here, and if anybody else wants to continue with the questions, they should ask them privately to Lisa. She's in the lab, so she has, if you don't find her email, just ask me and I'll follow up with the email of Lisa. So thank you again, Lisa, for this nice presentation and for launching this new series of talks. We'll then stop here and we'll prepare with Manas another presentation for next week, so that we have from now on the normal 2 o'clock Thursday afternoon presentation. So thank you everybody for being here.
Yes, thank you very much to everyone. I would like to say again that I'm a little sorry for this a little not smooth presentation, but I am happy to have been the first webinar speaker. Thank you, Andrei, for giving me this opportunity.
Okay, so bye-bye, and then we talk by mail and we'll chat again through the system in smaller groups. Bye for everybody.
Yeah,
Claps for
Bye.
Lisa and everybody.
Thank you.